Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. I'm really pleased that you're going to be spending some time with us this evening. We have two fantastic authors, actually three fantastic authors with us this evening, and I'm very excited. This is a little different. We usually do the American Revolution. As it turns out, I've completely turned tide here, and we have two British authors who are going to be talking about World War II. These are some great books from these fellows. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest host, who will be managing the question and answer period. You will see at the bottom of your screen, the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a chat feature. You will use that chat feature to send your questions. Those questions will come to me, and I will then forward those questions to our guest host, who will ask our authors your questions after they've both given their presentation. So with that being said, I'm pleased to introduce you to John R. Maass, who is the Programs and Education Staff Member of the new Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. He received his BA in History from Washington and Lee University and a PhD in Early American History from Ohio State. He's the author of several books and numerous articles on early United States military history, including North Carolina and the French and Indian War, The Spreading Flames of War, Defending a New Nation, 1783 to 1811, Road to Yorktown, Jefferson Lafayette and the British Invasion of Virginia, George Washington's Virginia, and the newly published The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, The Most Desperate Engagement. John lives near Mount Vernon, Virginia, and with that, I am very pleased to introduce you to John Maass. John, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Great to be here, and also glad to meet Simon and Alex. This is the first time I've met them, and hopefully one day we will live in a place where we can actually get together at a conference or a book tour or something like that. But this is the way it goes for now. So this is life. So as Roger indicated, I am in the Programs and Education Department at the brand new National Museum of the U.S. Army. You can see me for tickets. I'd be happy to take your money, although it's a free museum. Don't let that stop you. So we opened November 11th, and basically this is the first all-encompassing national museum that the Army has ever had. We are at Fort Belvoir. As I said, it's free. It's easy to get to on and off the campus. We have about 185,000 square feet in the building. About 85,000 square feet of that is exhibit space. We have a movie. We have a interactive STEM and geography experiential learning center. We have a rotating art gallery. We'd love to have you visit us. The museum's divided into galleries that include Revolutionary War of 1812, a Civil War related gallery, America Overseas, which includes the Army in the Philippines and World War I. We have an interwar period area followed by World War II, where we have an original Higgins boat, an original Sherman tank, a Bofors gun, all kinds of interesting things, weapons, uniforms. And then we have a Cold War gallery, which includes Korea and Vietnam. And finally, we have a gallery on modern operations, meaning Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and some on Somalia, the Gulf War. And finally, an Army and Society gallery, which is a very large gallery that talks about everything from engineering, Corps of Engineers, women in the military, integration, civil military relations, that kind of thing. So that is a very brief overview of the museum that would take you about 6 or 7 hours to go through the whole thing. But we welcome you, and we hope you'll join us at Fort Belvoir soon. So let me turn to the program now. Two World War II books that are now on my Christmas list, now that I've read the descriptions of them. The first by Simon Reed. Simon is an award-winning journalist and the author of 9 nonfiction books published on both sides of the Atlantic. His writing has appeared in Time, the San Francisco Chronicle, Publishers Weekly, and other publications. 3 of his books, including the critically acclaimed Winston Churchill Reporting and Human Game, Hunting the Great Escape Murderers, have been optioned for movie and television adaptation. Originally from the UK, he lives in Phoenix, Arizona with his wife and 2 sons. So Simon, as acting host, I actingly welcome you to the program. And
thank you, John.
Glad to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Tonight we're going to be talking about your new book, The Iron Sea. Right. And so I'd like to ask you for a thumbnail sketch of kind of the trajectory of the book and tell us what we can find in the book.
Sure. I'll start off with a gratuitous book shot. I'm not sharing any photos, but here we go. Iron Sea came out a couple of weeks ago. So when I sat down to write this book, I had a certain goal in mind. I confess, a sucker for the big summer Hollywood blockbuster type of movie. We all know the kind, big action spectacle, a story that moves really fast so you don't have to wait too long between explosions. And when I sat down to write Iron Sea, my intent was to try and incorporate those kind of aspects into the narrative of a military history book. And the idea to do that was proposed to me by my editor, a guy named Bob Pigeon, who also happens to be Alex's editor. And Bob and I worked on my previous book, Winston Churchill Reporting, which chronicles Churchill's adventures in his 20s as a war journalist. And Bob loved the book, and he particularly loved the combat scenes in it. And one afternoon we were having a conversation, and he said, for your next book, you need to do an all-out war story that's built around big combat action set pieces. Those were his words. But a book that has a strong enough, a strong storyline so the action has a real emotional resonance. And so although Iron Sea is a thoroughly researched work of military history, I actually think of it more as sort of a nonfiction action adventure story, one that chronicles the Allies' desperate and bloody campaign to break the backbone of Hitler's surface fleet. At the heart of the book, you have these 4 German Leviathans. You have the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and the battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz. And the story of the Allied hunt for these ships and their destruction plays out against the backdrop of the Battle of the Atlantic. Obviously, when we think of the Atlantic campaign, what we tend to think about is the U-boat menace. But surface raiders posed a serious threat to Britain during the war. Obviously, she's an island. She's prone to blockade and starvation. And these 4 ships in particular were of serious concern to Churchill. They bristled with immense firepower. They were faster than most ships in the British fleet. And they were fully capable of severing Britain's lifelines with her empire and the United States. Convoys are obviously Britain's lifeblood. They provide her heavily rationed population and her war machine with supplies, raw materials, and food. And an interesting fact I stumbled across when researching this book is that it required a minimum of 23 million tons of supplies a year to be shipped across the Atlantic to keep Britain in fighting shape. Every ton of cargo that arrives in a British port is a hard-won victory. Obviously, most of Western Europe is under the Nazi heel, so German aircraft operating out of France and the Low Countries can bomb and strafe convoys in the Channel, making their way to England's southern and eastern ports. And German U-boats and surface raiders operating out of German-held ports on the French Atlantic coast can have free roam of Britain's western approaches. And, the convoys, they're pretty easy targets. They're forced to go no faster than their slowest ships. And the threat of constant imminent attack takes a real psychological toll on convoy crews. One merchant sailor who served on convoy said it was like being put through sheer unmitigated hell all the time. And that's also sort of what these 4 ships put Churchill and his military planners through. Churchill deems the 4 ships mentioned as targets of supreme consequence, his words, and he becomes obsessed with their destruction. And like I said earlier, this book it's an action-based narrative. It opens up with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau rampaging across the waves in a killing spree in the early days of the war. Pretty early on, they sink 115,000 tons of Allied shipping. In June 1940, during the Norwegian campaign, they sink the British aircraft carrier Glorious and her 2 escorting destroyers, Ardent and Acosta. And Acosta is the last ship of the 3 to go down. She keeps fighting even after Ardent sunk, and it's apparent that Glorious is going to slip beneath the waves. And of Acosta's 138-man crew, 1 sailor, a guy named Cyril Carter, survives. And he writes very poignantly of the ship's sinking. He details that even as the ship is floundering, the crew cheer and roar their approval as they fire off their 1 final torpedo at their German attackers. And he describes the ship's medic. It's the medic's first naval posting. It's the medic's first time in combat. And he refuses to leave the side of the wounded even as the ship starts slipping under. And Cyril Carter and several crewmates who will eventually die of exposure make it into a lifeboat. And they look up and they see the captain leaning over the railing of the bridge. And they motion to the captain to come and join them in the lifeboat. And the captain shakes his head and he takes a cigarette case out of his jacket and he lights a smoke and he waves and he says, "No, I'll stay here, lads. Goodbye and good luck." And he disappears from view to go down with the ship. And it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's a small moment, but it's an incredibly powerful moment. And I think when you write books like this, especially when it's an action-based narrative, those small moments are really important. I think they're more powerful than the larger moments happening around them because it really conveys the human tragedy of the events going on. Several of the early chapters in the book are dedicated to the drama of the Hood and Bismarck, which to me is one of the great sort of epic stories of vengeance for the ages. Bismarck, she puts to sea on May 19th, 1941. 5 days later, she runs headlong into the Pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Hood. And 6 minutes after Hood fires the battle's opening salvo, she's sinking. And she takes all but 3 of her 1,400+ man crew with her. And 2 of the Hood survivors, Robert Tilburn and Ted Briggs, they recorded firsthand accounts of their experiences for the sound archives at the Imperial War Museum in London. And listening to it, it's mesmerizing. It's really hard-hitting stuff. And I relied on it heavily in the writing of this book. Tilburn's account, he really drives home sort of the bloody, gory nature of the conditions on the deck of Hood during the battle. At one point, he hears a shell coming in and he takes cover and he feels something heavy and wet land on his back, and he rolls over to see what it is, and it's the bottom half of a sailor who's been severed at the torso. Ted Briggs, he's in the compass platform during the battle, and so he has a front row seat to all the command decisions that are being played out during the confrontation. And when it becomes apparent that Hood is sinking, Briggs goes to vacate the compass platform to try and, obviously make his escape and survive. And as he leaves the platform, he turns around and he sees the senior officer on the ship, Admiral Lancelot Holland, sitting in his command chair. And next to Holland is the Hood's captain, Ralph Kerr. And the Hood is starting to tilt at a very sharp angle as she's taking on water. And Kerr is struggling to maintain his composure and stay upright as the deck continues to tilt more and more. And Holland is sitting in his chair and he's slumped forward and he has his head buried in his hands. And again, it's one of those small moments that sort of really paints the big picture, which is the utter grief that surrounded the loss of Hood. Her sinking really scarred the British national psyche.
Right.
Briggs makes it out of Hood. The ocean sort of sweeps him out, sweeps him away from the ship. And at one point, he sees 200 feet away from him the bow of Hood sticking straight up out of the water like a large gray tombstone. It only takes 3 minutes for Hood to sink. And in his recording for the War Museum, Briggs notes that seeing hood sticking up out of the water like that is the most terrifying aspect of his ordeal, and that image ends up haunting his nightmares for the next 40 years. Before Hood actually starts to sink, she explodes. There's a big explosion on board when a shell from Bismarck hits Hood's ammunition store. And the explosion is witnessed by the navigator's assistant on Bismarck, who's looking at Hood through his navigation viewfinder. And he writes that witnessing the blast is like being trapped in a hurricane. He actually writes that every nerve in my body felt the pressure of the explosion, and my only hope is that our children never have to experience such a thing. And to me, that's a really moving statement. And I think sometimes you can read sort of, some military history books, and they paint in broad brushstrokes of black and white. You got the good guys, you got the bad guys. There's not a lot of nuance in between. And I think sometimes that does a disservice to the reader. I think it's important to show the humanity on the opposing side. Sometimes there wasn't, but it was there. It's important to show the humanity on the opposing side, because if you don't, you sort of nullify the tragedy of the conflict as a whole. Obviously, the Royal Navy go on to hunt Bismarck down, and they sink her 3 days later. I wrote down the numbers. In the hunt, they employ 4 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 3 heavy cruisers, 10 light cruisers, and 21 destroyers. And when Bismarck goes down on May 27th, she takes all but 115 of her 2,100 plus crew with her. And the experiences of Bismarck's crew in the water after Bismarck sinks and Hood's crew in the water after Hood sinks kind of illustrates another aspect of the Iron Sea, is that it's not simply a book about Navy versus Navy. It's also a book about man versus the elements. And I think one of the most grueling examples of that in the book takes place in September 1943. The British launch a midget submarine raid against the Tirpitz and the Scharnhorst in their anchorages in Norway. And these midget submarines are about 12 feet long. They accommodate a crew of 3. And the outward journey from Scotland to Norway is absolutely hellacious. The seas are rough. The submarines are prone to mechanical failures. They're prone to leaks. They have terrible ventilation. So soon these cramped confines are stagnant with the smell of unwashed bodies. The men in these subs are violently seasick. They're operating with inches of vomit slushing around their ankles. One of the subs sinks, taking the crew with them, and it sort of pushes the men to the brink of human endurance. And it's, to me, just another stunning reminder of the extraordinary things that ordinary people were asked to do.
If I could, Sam, kind of going out to a little bit of a bigger picture, where would you rank the Battle of the Atlantic in terms of the overall campaigns in World War II as far as importance? And
I don't think you can sort of stress the importance of the Battle of the Atlantic. I would argue that it's probably the most pivotal campaign of the war. Obviously, I'm sure it's up for debate, but it's the campaign that establishes the foundation upon which sort of Allied victory is ultimately built. If the Allies had lost the upper hand in the Atlantic, Britain would no longer have been supplied. It's the supplying of Britain that keeps Britain in the war, that enables Britain to be used as a massive army base and an air base for operations against occupied Europe. It also allows Britain to supply Russia. We all know of Lend-Lease and the U.S. shipment of supplies to the U.K., but the British supply the Russians with 4 million tons of supplies independent of Lend-Lease. One interesting fact when I was researching this book is that in 1941, the Russians were desperate for armor. Their armor was just getting wiped out. By the end of 1941, 1/3 of all tanks used by the Soviets on the Eastern Front were the British Matilda II tanks. And that created a gap in the armor lines for the British in North Africa. The British plugged those lines with the Sherman tanks that the U.S. were sending over. So, when we think of the war, we think of, Normandy and Stalingrad and, the campaigns in in North Africa, you know, it had the Allies lost supremacy in the Atlantic, obviously those campaigns either might not have happened or it definitely wouldn't have been successful. So, you know, I think the Battle of the Atlantic has to rank up there as sort of number one. No.
Question about your sources. You just mentioned that you have some great first-person sources from the crew of the Hood and the Bismarck. Where did you do most of your research for this book?
Most of the research was done online. The great thing about the digital age. The bulk of the material came from the British National Archives, from the official combat reports kept by the British Admiralty, and also from the Imperial War Museum that has, again, the sound archive, which you can access online, brilliant first-hand accounts, but they also have letters, war diaries, and journals, and that provided the bulk of the research for this. And I've worked with the staffs at the Imperial War Museum and the British National Archives many times before, and they're godsends. They really are unsung heroes when it comes to sort of researching and writing.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Very interesting. I'm sure it's going to be well received, and I look forward to reading it myself. Let's move over to Alex. Let me introduce him. Alex Kershaw is an honorary colonel in the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division. He's a journalist, a public speaker, and widely acclaimed and award-winning author of several New York Times best-selling books about World War II, including The Bedford Boys, The Longest Winter, The Few, Escape from the Deep, The Liberator, and Avenue of Spies. A graduate of University College, Oxford, he worked as a journalist for The Guardian and other newspapers before moving to the US in 1994. His latest book is The First Wave, a national bestseller, published in May 2019 to mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. He has an honorary doctorate in military history from Norwich University and is director of the National World War II Memorial. He lives in Savannah and regularly leads battlefield tours and lectures on World War II. His 2012 book, The Liberator, has just been released as a drama series by Netflix, which I have just watched with my son and enjoyed it very much, Alex. So we're going to talk about The Longest Winter, and I have a few questions for you, if I might. Can you give us an overview of what The Longest Winter is about?
Yeah, sure. It's great to be with you, and congratulations on that awesome museum. It's
Thank you.
I have many times met with General Sullivan, who it was a big deal to him, and I'm really glad that it's come to fruition. It's a great achievement anyway. So I'm going to show you some images. Bear with me, because and hi to everybody that's tuned in, so to speak. I have to get these in chronological order, but anyway, I will put them up here, and then I can ramble for a while, if you'll forgive me. Okay. Because probably you've seen one beautiful, handsome Englishman, actually two, so a third is probably too much to deal with in one evening. Here's a really handsome German, and it's a famous shot. It's a propaganda photograph. Those of you who know a lot about the Battle of the Bulge and have Googled images before will know that this is a setup, but it shows you the enemy. The Longest Winter, my book, was published in 2004, and it is the story of the most decorated platoon, US platoon of World War II. They were an INR, Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, from the 99th Division on the 16th of December 1944, the opening day of the biggest battle the US has ever fought, which was the Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't in the American Revolution, which we lost, but it was the Battle of the Bulge. Over 1 million Americans involved in some capacity. The INR platoon of 18 men found themselves facing the most violent, the most Nazi of the SS spearhead in the Battle of the Bulge. And this is an SS grenadier here. I'm going to move on to the image. This shows you a nice action shot from the battle. You'll notice the snow, and I think the thing that we all know about the Battle of the Bulge is that it was fought in very cold conditions. Actually, many people say that it was the coldest winter for a generation. Sometimes guys literally froze to death in their foxholes if they didn't hug their foxhole buddy. You know, there's a cliche about war, which is that, you know, no foxhole is for just one man. That's a slip trench in the Italian mountains in the Italian campaign when they couldn't dig a big enough hole for two guys. But certainly the rule is that two guys go in a foxhole, and during the Battle of the Bulge, that was absolutely essential, because if you didn't have a guy to hug, you couldn't share his body warmth, you'd wake up frozen to death. You wouldn't wake up, basically. So moving on, that's the cover. Another great National Archives shot that we used for the cover, which actually shows you guys in those very wintry conditions on the border of Belgium and Germany. This took place in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. And actually the guys in that photograph resemble the guys in my platoon. The conditions are the same. Their position that they set up on the 16th of December 1944 was along a ridge line with trees behind them, looking down over a field, and then towards a village called Lanzerath. Now, unfortunately, the village of Lanzerath was part of Roll Barn B, and there were several roll barns for the SS. The SS were the only ones trusted by Hitler to carry out the Ardennes offensive. He didn't trust the Wehrmacht because they tried to kill him, or so he thought after the 20th of July plot. So he gave the big job, the last big gamble of World War II, he gave it to the SS. And unfortunately, one of the routes, the so-called roll barns for the SS, for these Kampfgruppe, was Lanzerath. It was right in the middle of Roll Barn B for a guy called Jochen Peiper, the poster boy for the SS, a very notorious figure, just 28 years old. He led Kampfgruppe Peiper along that roll barn and hit, bang, slam into my platoon, the INR platoon, that held these positions over on a hillside overlooking a road and the village of Lanzerath. Here's the platoon commander. Now, unbelievably, this guy was 14 when he joined the National Guard. I don't quite know how you could be allowed to join the National Guard at 14, but he did, and he did for money and out of patriotism or patriotism. It doesn't matter how you pronounce it, but two reasons: he wanted to serve his country, but also he needed the money because he grew up in the heart of the Depression, in the heart of America, in Missouri. And this is a picture of him in training. He became the lieutenant, the commander of the INR platoon, aged 20. So he's one of the youngest commissioned officers in World War II. Age 20, that's pretty young. And he found himself in command of these 18 guys. And on the 16th of December, 1944, Lyle Balk, you're looking at him here, was given an order around about 10 o'clock in the morning. Massive barrage. A lot of these guys cowered in their foxholes and their positions with their hands over their ears. He was given an order. It's very clear: hold your position at all costs. And he did so. And the platoon did so all day long on the 16th of December. 4 full frontal attacks by the Germans, so it was crazy. They killed, we think, at least 100, maybe 200 Germans, machine gun most of them. And anyway, by the end of the day, it was around about 4:30 when the light began to fade. The Germans got a smart idea, which was that instead of running suicidally towards these 18 guys who they thought were at least a regiment because the firepower was so heavy, they thought it might be a smart idea to outflank them. And that's exactly what they did. They went through a series of woods and outflanked them. And finally, around about 5 o'clock in the evening, on the 16th of December, they pulled these guys out literally from their holes. Excuse me. And many of the men in the platoon had actually run out of ammunition. They'd fired their last their rounds from their M1s, their carbines. They'd run out of ammunition for the Jeep-mounted 50 cals. And they were literally pulled out of their foxholes. Or the Germans said, you know, come out or we'll kill you. We'll throw a grenade in, or we'll pepper you with a machine pistol. Lyle Balk was in a dugout beside a 19-year-old called Bill James, who was his runner. Private Bill James, and as the light faded, a machine pistol, the barrel of a machine pistol came thrusting through about a 6-inch gap that was at the front of this foxhole, and Bulge instinctively brushed the barrel away, knocked the barrel away. The German opened fire, and the bullets hit Private James right beside Bulge in the face, and literally tore off most of his face. James would survive, but he would have to have 37 plastic surgery operations after the war to try and restore his face. These guys were all taken prisoner. There were 18 guys in the platoon. 2 of them very severely wounded. One guy that was attached to the platoon as a forward artillery observer, a guy called Peter Gacki, was killed. He was the only fatality that day, and they were taken down into the village of Lanzerath after dark. Bulge was shot in the leg as he moved down the hillside. He had to prop up his friend and runner, Bill James. His uniform was soaked with blood, and they were all placed in a cafe called the Café Lanzerath. And I'll just tell one more story before ending the narrative. It's kind of truncated, but around about 10 o'clock in the evening, as Lyle Bulge lay sat there with his best buddy and the private who he respected most, Bill James, sort of slumped against him, bleeding. He looked up at a cuckoo clock, and in this cafe there was, above him on the wall was this really beautiful cuckoo clock. And I interviewed Lyle for around about a week, day after day after day, until he got sick to death of me. And he said that, you know, when he was a kid, when he was, 12, 13 years old, his aunt had said to him that you'll come to nothing. You're a ne'er-do-well. If you live to 21, it will be a miracle. But if you do live to 21, you'll have a long and prosperous life. And he was 20 years old on the 16th of December, 1944. He turned 21, believe it or not, on the 17th of December, 1944. So he sat there, he's got his platoon shot up, he's carried out his orders, all 18 guys have been captured and wounded, and he's extremely depressed. There's only been an action in real combat for 1 day in the war, and he feels like he's really failed. And he looks up at the cuckoo clock and he sees the hand moving towards midnight. And he said that when that hand finally hit midnight, he felt this immense sense of relief that he actually managed to survive to turn 21. And what a hell of a way, if you think about it, to become a legal adult, to turn 21 in those conditions. Anyway, cut a long story short, very long story, very short. He and his platoon were taken into captivity. They endured the longest winter. That's why the book's called The Longest Winter. And they were liberated from several camps in the late spring of 1945. Lyle here was liberated from Moosburg just a couple of days from death. Actually, a beautiful part of the story is that he was liberated by his commanding officer, a guy called Major Robert Kreese, who had selected him to lead the INR platoon before the Battle of the Bulge. And Kreese had learned that some of his guys were in Moosburg, which contained over 50,000 POWs. And when he learned that some of his regiment and the INR platoon were in the camp, he himself got his jeep and drove into the camp, found out where Lyle was, walked into the barracks and literally picked him out of his bunk, held him in his arms, and then carried him to a jeep and then to a hospital, thereby saving his life. The story has a very happy ending. It's a Hollywood ending. Here are survivors from the platoon. Lyle is furthest to my right. I don't know whether it's like your left or right, just below the flags. And these are the survivors from those 18 men in that platoon, the most decorated platoon of World War II, as I said. This is taken on the first day of the season at Yankee Stadium in 1979. Steinbrenner, who owned the Yankees at the time, heard about Bill James. Bill James pestered him, and these guys had, in 1978, had been finally given medals under Jimmy Carter. There was a long campaign to get them recognized, and finally they were recognized, given medals, and Steinbrenner invited them, paid for all their expenses for them and their families to come to Yankee Stadium and to be formally recognized. Lyle threw the first ball and made the first pitch, and then these guys' names were put up in lights before a very, very raucous, very appreciative, packed Yankee Stadium. So not only were they finally recognized in terms of medal counts, which made them the most decorated platoon of World War II, but they were also recognized publicly in front of a very large crowd. Just to finish off, I'm going to do a little bit of inspirational. I'm going to be a little bit inspirational right now. Those of us who've gone through a hellish year, and mine hasn't been too bad actually. I've been writing away because I haven't been too distracted. But for all of us, these are words that were very important to Lyle Balk. This is a quote from a guy called Christian Larsen, and he was probably the biggest self-help writer of the early part of the 20th century. And Lyle had ripped a page from the book by Christian Larsen, which was a massive bestseller, and he kept it with him all the way through that longest of winters, that coldest of winters of 1944-45, when he was in the POW camp and severely depressed and malnourished and almost died of hepatitis. And he would read these lines over and over again to give himself confidence, to make sure that he could have the strength to get up every day and try and stay alive. And I'll just quote one thing. To be so strong, it says, promise yourself to be so strong that nothing can disturb your peace of mind, to talk health, happiness, and prosperity to every person you meet, to make all your friends feel that there is something in them, to look at the sunny side of everything and make your optimism come true, to think only of the best, to work only for the best and expect only the best, to be just as enthusiastic about the success of others as you are about your own, to forget the mistakes of the past and press on to the greater achievements of the future, to wear a cheerful countenance at all times and give every living creature you meet a smile, etc., etc. And then finally he says, and this is the moral of my book, The Longest Winter, it's the moral of World War II, it's the moral that we should remember when we think of the 138,000 Americans that were killed during the liberation of Europe, which began on the 10th of July 1943 and ended on the 8th of May 1945, to be too large for worry, too noble for anger, too strong for fear, and too happy to permit the presence of trouble. If only today, more and more of us could remember those words when we confront our current troubles. But anyway, it's been wonderful to share the story with you. I'll stop the images now and hope you're all having a great evening.
Well, thank you. Before I ask another question, I just want to remind those in the audience that if they have a question, they can put it into the chat function of Zoom, and Roger will see those, and we'll ask some of those coming up here very shortly. But Alex, let me ask you this one quick question, and then we'll try the chat function. What happened to the platoon while they were in captivity? What kind of ordeals did they go through there?
Actually, they were pretty well treated. American POWs were well treated because basically we treated German POWs really, really well. I mean, you know, they were mostly sent to America, and people have probably heard stories about how in the South, for example, you know, you could go into a cinema in some places in the South, and the Germans would be there at the front of the audience watching a movie, and blacks would be up in the, you know, way back in the cheap seats. So we treated them very, very well. I think there's only one case of a single German escaping from captivity in the US because, you know, it was incredibly difficult to get out of the US and back to Germany. You had to cross the Atlantic somehow. But I suspect that a lot of them really wanted to stay. You know, life was a lot better as a POW in the US during World War II. And certainly that's the case with Italian prisoners that were kept by the British and the Germans that we looked after in Britain during World War II. A remarkable number decided to stay on afterwards. Anyway, one story about the platoon is interesting, which is that they were placed in Hammelburg. And those Patton fans, don't all raise your hands. I mean, I'm sure that you're all Patton fans. I'm a huge fan. Patton, in late March of 1945, sent a task force Baum, named after Abraham Baum, a Jewish tailor in New York, to go and literally save his son-in-law, a guy called Waters, who'd been captured in North Africa in early 1943. So you have several hundred guys, over 30 tanks, sent 70 miles behind enemy lines to liberate a POW camp, Hammelburg. Crazy, crazy, crazy mission, and it went disastrously wrong. And had it been made public at the time, Patton certainly would have faced very serious repercussions. I mean, it's one thing to kick a guy up the ass in Sicily and slap another guy. He did it twice. The slapping incident was really a kicking and a slapping incident. But then to literally waste dozens of men's lives on a suicide mission to go and save your son-in-law, not good, not good. Anyway, it was kept secret at the time, as much as it could be. But most of my platoon found themselves in Hammelburg when the task force finally arrived. When Baum arrived at Hammelburg, these guys were inside, and the first thing they saw was the star on the side of a Sherman tank, and they thought, "Oh my God, it's over! We're liberated! We're free!" 24 hours later, they're being marched back into Hammelburg as POWs again. So you can imagine how dispiriting that was to have survived until March of 1945, and then to be liberated, and then to be captured again and put back in the same camp. So that's the kind of it was a really nice part of the story, because you had this kind of false victory, and I play it out quite some length, because Lyle Bauk, who I've talked about, he actually was on the second tank. When they tried to break out, when the task force arrived at Hammelburg, they picked up only so many men. There were over 1,500 POWs in Hammelburg, and they can only take less than 100 back to Allied lines of them. It was going to be an impossible journey anyway. But Lyle Bauk volunteered. He said, "I'm going. I'm gonna fight my way out of this hell. I don't care. I'm done." And he actually was on the second tank in the column as it tried to escape, with a carbine and a guy beside him with a grease gun, and sadly he didn't make it. So that was an interesting aspect of the story. Thank you for asking the question.
Okay, we have a question for Simon from one of our listeners, which is that your book details what's believed to be the greatest raid of all time. And can you tell us about that?
Sure. Let me just, am I on? No, I'm not mute. Okay, great. One of the joys about writing Iron Sea was getting a chance to write about some things that are known in the UK, but not necessarily known here in the US. And one of those things is Operation Chariot, which is considered by some to be the greatest raid of all time. Its intent was to deny the battleship Tirpitz an Atlantic base of operations. Tirpitz spends most of her war anchored in the fjords of Norway, but Churchill is terrified that she'll eventually break into the North Atlantic and sever Britain's artery with the United States. And so Operation Chariot is an attack on the French port of Saint-Nazaire. It's 6 miles up the Loire estuary off the French Atlantic coast, and it's home to the Normandy dry dock, which is the only dry dock large enough to accommodate a ship Tirpitz's size. And the British decide they're going to destroy this dock, and the plan they hatch to do it is sort of completely nuts. They take an old destroyer called HMS Campbelltown. They load it with 10,000 pounds of time-delayed explosives. And the plan is to sail this destroyer up the Loire estuary, past all the German land defenses, and ram it into the dry dock. And then a team of commandos on the destroyer will jump off the ship, raid the port, destroy a bunch of port facilities, and sailing in support of the destroyer, Campbelltown, are about a dozen motor launches, each with their own little commando teams. Those teams will also raid the port, blow a bunch of stuff up on land, and all the commandos will scurry back onto the motor launches, hightail it back to England, and the next morning, the Campbelltown will explode, destroy the dry dock, and the Tirpitz won't have sort of anywhere to sort of go in for repairs if she makes it into the Atlantic. So the raid takes place on the night of March 28th, 1942. The attack force, the British attack force numbers 611 men. That includes commandos, medics, and sailors. And they sail into a port that's defended by 48 artillery pieces, 23 anti-aircraft guns, which can be turned against naval targets, and more than 5,000 German soldiers. And the attack fleet, the destroyer and its motor launches, they actually make it most of the way up the Loire estuary. They're about a mile from the target before the Germans catch on to what's happening. And the Germans unleash bloody hell. And the motor launches are made of wood, and their fuel tanks sit on top of the deck. And these motor launches just get shredded to pieces. And the fuel tanks are exploding, and burning gasoline is falling in, spilling into the river. The river's catching fires. A lot of commando teams are wiped out before they even reach the target. Men who fall overboard either drown or, get consumed by the flames. I mean, it's total chaos and carnage. But the British actually succeed in ramming the Campbelltown into the dry dock, and several commando units do make it into the port and blow up some gun emplacements and some port machinery. But the problem is there aren't enough motor launches to bring the commandos home. And so this operation turns into this all-night bloody slog for survival. And this small group of commandos, about 100 men, they fight their way out of the port into the town of Saint-Nazaire itself. It becomes a street-by-street, building-by-building urban brawl. And the commandos eventually surrender at daybreak the next morning because they're out of ammunition and they're just overwhelmed by superior German numbers. And there's a great moment that I loved writing about with this operation. So the next morning, the British commandos are being marched off into captivity, and there's a German soldier, and he's standing there looking across the harbor at the Campbelltown smashed into the dry dock, and he taps a British commander on the shoulder, and he says, "Well, you're not going to be using that boat again, are you?" And 1 minute after he says that, the 10,000 pounds on the time delayed fuses they explode, and by all accounts, it is an absolute elemental, massive roar of an explosion. It's estimated there are about 400 Germans poking around on the ship out of curiosity at the time the explosion happens. And one account says that 2 days later, they were still peeling body parts off the roofs and the walls of buildings in Saint-Nazaire. One description says the explosion blew body parts to all points of the compass. And it's just it's a remarkable story. I've actually received emails from a couple of people who read the book who asked if it really happened. And yes, it did. It's just as crazy as it sounds. And even the Germans themselves, the day after the raid, there was a German radio broadcast, and they said the heart of every German beats with respect for the Englishmen who carried out this action. And the official German report on the raid, which is you can find in the British National Archives, even that says, this raid is a prime example of how the British operate with stealth and cunning. And so it's one of the centerpieces of the Iron Sea, and it was a real joy to write about.
Very good, thank you. Well, if anybody has any other listeners have a question, please put it in the chat. But I'll pose this brief question to both authors, and since Simon, you are in the spotlight right now, I'll go first with you. What is your next project? What are you writing about now?
I'm on sabbatical right now.
Okay. I thought you were supposed to be writing on a sabbatical.
The Iron Sea was, I started the Iron Sea in 2016. So it's been, 3.5, 4 years of researching and writing. And right now I'm taking a break. We'll see what happens down the road.
All right. And Alex, how about yourself?
I am trying to finish up a book. It's called Against All Odds, and it's about 4 guys from the 3rd Division, the 3rd ID. The 3rd ID spent longest in combat in World War II in Europe, 635 days. Received more Medal of Honors than any other US division in Europe. 101st Airborne, the glamour boys of World War II because of Band of Brothers. We all know that they won every battle in Western Europe in World War II. In fact, they received only 2 Medal of Honors. The 3rd Division received 40, which is an astonishing achievement. Of the 3 regiments in the 3rd Division, the 15th received 16 Medal of Honors. One of the guys that received the Medal of Honor from the 15th Infantry Regiment that was there on day 1 when Europe began to be liberated was Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier, not just in World War II, but as you guys know at the US Army Museum, the most decorated US soldier in your entire military history. So my book's about him, but it's also about 3 other guys that fought at some point shoulder to shoulder with him. One of them is a guy called, at the end of the Second World War, he achieved the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. It's a guy called Keith Ware. And you'll know also at the museum that he is the highest ranking Army general to be killed in Vietnam in 1968, shot down in a helicopter, and a couple of other guys. So they're all in the same, at the end of the book, they're all in the same battles at Colmar Pocket, Nuremberg, etc. And it's the story of those four guys that fought, I believe they fought longest and hardest and really got the job done to an extent and a degree that's really quite unimaginable. I mean, imagine, one of the guys, today, I won't go on too long, but today I'm writing about one of them. There's a guy called Maurice Britt. And I wish I could see the whole screen, because I'd like to ask everybody listening right now, do you know who Maurice Britt is? And I'm betting that most people don't. But Maurice Britt is the first American, and this is a huge deal. He's the first American to win every single medal for valor in a single war. Never done before. So he won the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, the DSC, and the Medal of Honor, all in 18 months, and he belonged to the 3rd Division. And in March of 1945, the 3rd Division had a newspaper called Frontline, good title for a newspaper, and they actually turned it into a kind of a sports game. It was a match between Audie Murphy, who was racking up medals every day, and Maurice Britt, who got there first, who by December of 1944, Maurice Britt from Arkansas, he became the lieutenant governor after the war, fought all the way through Sicily, Italy, badly wounded, had his arm blown off at Anzio. By December 1944, he was a superstar in America. I mean, he was like the World War II superstar, because he was the first guy to win every single medal, and he was paraded everywhere. He received the Medal of Honor on the 6th of June 1944, D-Day in Arkansas. But then he was pipped to the post. Literally, by the end of the war, Audie Murphy beat him by 1 medal. So it's a kind of a story of a race for glory. But all these guys that I'm writing about now, and I'm loving doing it. They all wear the same patch, and they all gave everything against literally all odds. So I'm got to finish it by end of March. So hopefully there'll be a vaccine by then, and I can actually get the hell out of my study and my office. And sorry to say, get the hell out of this country and go back to Europe and sit in a foxhole somewhere and drink to Audie Murphy and Maurice Britt. Anyway, that's what I'm doing.
That's amazing to survive World War II and then get killed in action in Vietnam.
Yeah, absolutely, incredible. Yeah, I mean, he's
staggering.
Yeah, if you Google him, I managed to track down his widow, which is a big deal. And she told me that she met him in 1946. She went to work she's called Joyce Ware. She met her husband, Keith Ware. He was total badass. Total badass. I mean, this guy was Audie Murphy's company commander in Sicily. B Company went from, actually, Keith Ware is a remarkable American. He's the first guy to become a general officer, having been drafted in World War II. The first guy to go through officer training school and become a general officer, which is extraordinary. He was a 26-year-old clerk in a store in Los Angeles before the war. He gets drafted, then becomes the first guy to become a general who's a draftee. Anyway, cut a long story short, his widow, I found his widow, and this is an amazing thing. I'm sure you know, Simon, when you actually find someone that's alive still that can tell you stuff, it's incredible. And she told me that she watched a movie. She went to work at the Pentagon when she was 16, and she was watching a movie in Washington, D.C. in late May of 1945, after the war was over. And she was with a girlfriend. She's very, very attractive, and she was a girlfriend who was also very attractive. And they were watching a newsreel before the movie, and Joyce turned to her girlfriend and said, like, who's the guy? Who's the guy in the sunglasses? And it was a newsreel of 5 guys, for the first time in US military history, receiving the Medal of Honor on the battlefield. It was at Nuremberg. After Nuremberg fell, they blew up the big swastika above the Zeppelin Stadium, and 5 guys from the 3rd ID received the Medal of Honor from General Patch. And way down the line, this guy is like 5'8". He's the only guy with cool shades on, and it was Keith Ware. And so she's there, Joyce. She hadn't met him yet, and she nudges her girlfriend and says, like, "Cool, he's a bit of all right. He's nice looking." That's my British accent there, but she's like, "Who's that guy? He's nice." Fast forward 2 years, she's just going through a scrapbook and she finds the picture. She's like, oh my God, I saw him before I married him. I fancied him before I married him. How could I? It's extraordinary. So anyway, stuff like that is amazing. You know, we're coming to the end of. I'm going to be out of business soon. I really am, because if I can't talk to these people anymore, I'm not sure that I can just spend all my life in archives. You know, it's kind of everyone can, and you know. But the fact that there's people still alive, that you can pick up the phone and you can press the tape recorder and you can get this gold. I mean, it's like molten gold pouring itself out of a phone onto my desk. I mean, it's just like gold. You can't make that stuff up, but it's
Right.
Anyway, I'm ranting on now, but
That's all right. We have one final question for both Simon and Alex. What got you guys passionate about writing World War II books?
For me, it was my grandfather. He served in RAF Bomber Command during the Second World War. He flew 48 operations over occupied Europe, 2 tours of duty with 214 Squadron and then number 7 Pathfinder Squadron. And he always played it coy with his World War II experiences. He always sort of cast him in a, in sort of a humorous light. But after he passed away when I was, and by the way, I should say that he's also the one who introduced me to the Great Escape movie, which really, when I was about 7 or 8, which really developed my love for Second World War history. But he passed away when I was 15, and one of the things I got was his operations logbook. And in it were photographs and a number of combat reports from his experiences. And that really was an eye-opening experience. He went through some horrendous things. You know, he was also Jewish, you know, so flying operations over occupied Europe as a Jew, that was not a that was a pretty daring thing to do. He was a rear gunner, as they call it in the RAF. But his logbook and his combat reports inspired me to actually write my first book, which was called The Killing Skies, which came out in the UK, about the British bomber offensive against Nazi Germany. And it's kind of the British bomber offensive, but filtered through his experiences in the war. He was 25 years old, and his air crew, the members of his crew called him Dad, because he was so much older than the rest of them. And he was also called Jinx because he had such terrible luck. And supposedly he was the first British airman to get frostbite. Now, I don't know if that on an operation, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what one of his crew members told me about 20 years ago when I tracked down sort of surviving members of his crew. So yeah, that's what did it for me.
Alex, how about you?
Well, you know, I'd like to echo that by saying that, you know, of course I was terribly moved and impressed and like overwhelmed by my grandfather's courage. Both of them served in World War II. But, you know, one was in the RAF and the other one was in the Navy. The one that was in the Navy was killed before my mum got to know him. I think she was 6 months old when he died. He was in the Malta run, on one of the great British destroyers of World War II, HMS Ajax. Simon will know all about HMS Ajax. But anyway, I'll be honest, and I'll say that the reason why I really got into World War II is because I became obsessed with World War II through comics when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I was bored off my backside at my grandparents' house one summer, and I found a stash of World War II comics, you know, action hero comics, and I couldn't stop reading them. They were awesome. I loved them. So ever since, I've been trying to write a comic, but unfortunately they've turned into books, and maybe I should have a second career as actually writing a real comic. But what's so nice about the Netflix thing, without giving my show a plug, is that if you'd asked me, oh my God, you know, you're supposed to be a serious World War II historian, which I'm not. I'm a journalist, I'm a hack at heart. But if someone had said to me, oh my God, they're going to turn one of your books into an animated series on TV, you know, a lot of people would say, oh, no, I just won the Pulitzer. No. But I was like, wow, really? That's my dream, to have my book turned into an animated movie? Well, don't you know that I've always loved comics? That's why I got into World War II in the first place. So anyway, I'm kind of chuffed that it finally, the book that I took longest over, that I cared perhaps most about, did end up turning into a comic, but on the TV screen rather than in your local newsagent. So there you go.
Well, that's terrific. So we're back to me. I'm Roger Williams, and we're going to wrap up the show. You heard my grandfather clock in the background there, but I'm just thrilled, to have both Simon and Alex here tonight. I just love a good story, and Simon and Alex are two remarkable storytellers, to take facts and tell. I mean, one can read academic history. These guys are real, just honest to God, visual storytellers. You feel like you're there. Your heart's pounding when you read the books from these guys. And for anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of reading their books, you are in for a real treat. You will be mesmerized, and I truly recommend that, and I truly mean that. I want to thank Simon and Alex for their time tonight and for their presentations. I had, through the chat feature, I had given the URL for the bookshop where you can purchase their books. You can also go to historyauthortalks.com, or you can go to Simon's website, which is just simonreedwriting.com, or Alex's website, which is just alexkershaw.com, and learn more about their work. I also want to thank John Maass, and for his stewardship over our question and answer period in introducing the authors, and my thanks to the National Museum of the United States Army, and also at the History Author Talks bookshop. You can find John's books. We're taking a little bit of a break. I've been doing History Author Talks since the pandemic started back in late February and early March. So I'm taking really the month of December off. On January 5th, our next show is Building an Army for the War After the War to End All Wars, where we're going to have Patrick K. O'Donnell, who is a friend of all of ours, along with Paul Dixon, who has written a book called The Rise of the GI Army, 1940-41. So we're sticking with World War I and World War II for our January 5th show. Then the following week, we have Todd Braystead, Don Haggist, and Don Johnson. We're going back to the American Revolution, but we're looking at it from the British perspective. All the King's men who tried to put British America back together again. We're looking at occupied America, and the noble volunteers, the British soldier who fought in the British soldiers who fought in the American Revolution. So we're, as you can see, we're friends with our mother country still, in many ways. But I wish you all a very happy holiday season. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. And again, my thanks to our guests and my guest hosts. And I thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, John. Thank you, Alex.
Good night.
Take care, guys.
All right.